By the autumn of 2011, my mom had resided in an assisted living apartment for a little over 2 years. She was a bit unsteady on her feet. She used one of those rolling walkers to get around, and she battled a few orthopedic challenges on a daily basis. But as far as she, or I, or anyone else knew, she was otherwise reasonably healthy for a woman of 77 years. That is, until she fell in her apartment on Halloween morning. An ambulance took her to St. Mary's in Milwaukee, and they kept her for a few hours running a variety of tests. By mid-afternoon, I got a call saying that she was ready to be picked up. When I entered the ER, I found the room where she was, and of course, asked her how she was feeling. A nurse asked us to wait a moment before leaving so that the doctor on duty could give us some paperwork. He soon came in, introduced himself to me, handed me a packet of pages, and called my attention to a particular line on the CT scan results. Probable multiple masses in both lungs. He calmly recommended that I share these results with her primary care physician. We drove from the ER to Cops. I mean, it was Halloween day after all, and one of the flavors was pumpkin chocolate chip, and that was not to be missed. But over custard, we both wondered aloud about those test results. Cancer didn't really run in the family, and there were no warning signs in her entire medical history. She had smoked for a time in her youth, but she quit well before becoming pregnant with me. Well, perhaps there was a glitch in the scanning machine, we thought. Or perhaps whatever was in her lungs was benign. I took her home and, of course, put in a call to her physician. And again, that was Halloween day, so October 31st. By Thanksgiving, just a few short weeks later, we had seen her primary care doc, had her out here at St. Mary's, Ozaukee for a needle biopsy procedure, and had scheduled an appointment with a recommended oncologist. Just a few days after Thanksgiving, that oncologist told us that the tumors in her lungs were numerous, malignant, and very advanced. He estimated that she had about 6 months to live, and that turned out to be an overly optimistic forecast. She declined at a startling rate, day by day, and passed away peacefully, thanks to good hospice care, on December 12th. Now, some of you here tonight knew my mom, and you would probably agree with me that the word prudent is not one of the first words that comes to mind as a description of her. She was incredibly kind, compassionate, fun-loving, wacky, whimsical, and as so many have said to me over the years, one of a kind. Prudent doesn't even make the top 10 list. But she took some very prudent steps in her later years. She had long-term care insurance. She had her will, power of attorney, and healthcare directives updated. Now, as an aside, for those of you who don't know, my parents divorced when I was in first grade, and I have no siblings. So I'm kind of it. I am the power of attorney, the executor, the beneficiary, the everything. She had talked to me and also to the pastoral staff at North Shore Congregational in Fox Point about her wishes for her memorial service, who would preach, who would sing, and she even had a very specific and completely non-negotiable directive that mint ice cream with hot fudge be served at the reception. And she talked to me about a number of items that held particular value, whether sentimental or otherwise, and where those items might ultimately end up. So, during that very short Halloween day to early December time period, as life sort of slipped away for her, she didn't need to spend any energy on putting her affairs in order. She had already done that work. Instead, she and I had some good heart-to-heart talks, sharing memories and a lot of I love yous, and I know she did the same with a number of her close friends. There was one loose end, however, one matter that she felt demanded her attention. Apparently, she had already decided that a Christmas present she would give to me that year would be a University of Wisconsin sweatshirt. Now, I'm an alum and she had gone there too, so we shared that good Badger pride. And alas, whatever Badger wear I had formerly owned had long since been worn out and discarded. She saw that gaping hole in my wardrobe and was determined to rectify the situation. But as she began to suspect she might not make it to Christmas, and as she became bedridden in her last week or so of life, she enlisted the help of a friend to purchase, box, and wrap the sweatshirt and make sure that I received it after she was gone, but before Christmas. And that's exactly what happened. One loose end. That's all she needed to address. She essentially said to her friend, one more thing before I go, I need you to buy Rob a Badger sweatshirt. Once that loose end had been tied up, she was ready to go forth from this earthly life in peace. 5 years later, in May of 2016, my dad fell in his apartment, broke his pelvis, and landed at St. Mary's in Milwaukee. He had battled congestive heart failure for years, along with various cardiopulmonary challenges. While in the hospital, in great pain from the broken pelvis, he developed pneumonia. The downward spiral was, I guess, mercifully brief. In a matter of just about 72 hours, he went from stable condition to needing the absolute maximum rate of oxygen available even in the ICU. And then into a palliative care phase that lasted only 11 hours. At dawn, on the day before Memorial Day, he passed away peacefully, thanks to the comfort care administered right in the ICU. Okay, now, unlike my mom, my dad definitely could be described as prudent. He loved to laugh, he loved to eat, he loved people, and he truly treasured friendship. But he was not, at least not during my lifetime, what anyone would call a party animal. He was somewhat low-key, careful, thoughtful, thorough, detail-oriented, and conscientious. He spent the final quarter century or so of his life having what seemed like an operation a year, from quintuple bypass to 2 hip replacements and seemingly everything in between. And so he had lots of time to contemplate his mortality. So he too took a number of prudent steps He too had his estate planning documents updated. He too made sure I was listed as an authorized signature on virtually everything. He too made sure that he shared some wishes regarding his memorial service. And he too showed me which items were special, whether for their value as antiques or heirlooms or both. And so, when things took a turn for the worse, like my mom 5 years earlier, he didn't need to spend energy on those end-of-life arrangements that can consume so many seniors and their families. He had already done that work. Though the end came swiftly, he and I were able to share some memories and I love yous without any worry whatsoever about anything legal. But there was one loose end, one final matter that my dad wanted to address. He showed me an ordinary sheet of paper from a yellow legal pad. On it, he had handwritten the names and postal addresses of 5 nonprofits, and next to each one, a dollar amount. He emphatically asked me to treat these 5 donations as top priorities upon his death. As soon as was feasible after his passing, he wanted my word that I would write and mail those 5 checks. And that's exactly what I did. One loose end. That's all he needed to address. He essentially said to me, one more thing before I go. Please promise me you'll make these 5 donations. Once I had happily made that commitment, he was ready to meet death whenever it came calling. And it turns out to have been a pretty short wait. The late 20th century Roman Catholic theologian Henri Nouwen wrote, quote, "When we are ready to die at any moment, we are also ready to live at any moment." Now, folks, that in and of itself is a powerful and provocative statement. But Nouwen had much more to write during his career on many subjects, including death, and specifically the death of Jesus. What I appreciate as I read Scripture is that Jesus saw death, and his own death in particular, as more than a way of getting from one place to the other. He saw his death as potentially fruitful in itself and of enormous benefit to the disciples. Death was not an ending for him, but a passage to something much greater. When Jesus was anticipating his own death, he kept repeating the same theme to his disciples. My death is good for you, because my death will bear many fruits beyond my death. Jesus sees that the real fruits of his life will mature after his death. That is why he adds, it is good for you that I go. Wow. On this Maundy Thursday evening, Nouwen's words certainly strike me as spot on. Jesus had a clear sense that his time was coming, and soon. And he had a clear sense that his death was going to be life-changing and even transformative for his family and friends, for the disciples, and even for the entire world. Once the events of what we call Palm Sunday had taken place, he surely knew that this would be his last Passover. In fact, he almost certainly knew that his crucifixion was imminent. And from Scripture we know that he wasn't entirely at peace with the way things were unfolding. For example, the Gospels tell of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane literally begging God to give him an exit strategy, a way out of the plan. "Take this cup from me," he prayed. But then, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." Preacher and author John Ortberg once said that each of us has a shadow mission, a dark desire that apart from God's help and one's own vigilant obedience can hijack one's authentic God-given mission. Ortberg said that even Jesus had a shadow mission, specifically to be the leader without suffering, to be the Messiah without a cross. If indeed Jesus was haunted by this or any other shadow mission, we know from how things turned out that he was able to push that to the side. Focus like a laser beam on God's will alone and be, in the words of Philippians 2, obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Whatever measure of peace Jesus was able to find on this night, this Passover night, this night of betrayal, must surely have come, at least in part, from knowing that he had already taken a number of prudent steps. He had allocated his time and presence, if you think of a map, among the little towns up north in Galilee, Jerusalem and the surrounding Judean villages to the south, the in-between area of Samaria, and even some areas east of the Jordan River controlled by King Herod. He had managed his public notoriety, becoming just well known enough to be highly controversial. So his death would be noteworthy in the eyes of friend and foe alike. And he recruited and trained a team, a cadre of disciples who had traveled with him, listened to his preaching and teaching, observed many healings, and witnessed many miracles. They were far from perfect, of course, but he hoped they would spread the good news after he was gone. Over the span of 3 years, he had built them up and taught them well. But there was one loose end. One final matter Jesus felt compelled to address. He knew that 11 of the 12 sharing the feast with him had their hearts in the right place. But they were only human. And after he ascended into heaven, the axiom might very well hold true. Out of sight, out of mind. What on earth could he do to address the possibility that his followers, maybe even his closest disciples, might essentially forget him? What if their understanding, clear as it might have been on that Thursday night, about who he was and what he said and what he did, and so importantly, why? What if that clarity of understanding simply faded from their thoughts after he was gone? Having so carefully laid the groundwork for a movement that could potentially endure and grow in perpetuity, what could he do to address this one loose end? The possibility, however remote, that the flame could die out. give similar, although not identical, accounts. In mid-meal, it seems, Jesus reached forward and took hold of bread. And it may very well have been a thin, cracker-like sheet of unleavened bread. In what I imagine to have been a strong voice that couldn't be ignored, he said the blessing, and then he broke the bread, and he passed the halves to his friends, saying, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Some minutes later, Scripture says, after supper, Jesus again reached forward, this time to grasp a wine-filled cup. I suspect he again piped up in a bold voice and said a customary blessing. Then, passing it to his friends, he said, "Take, drink. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me." One loose end. That's all he needed to address. It's as though he said to them, one more thing before I go. You'll have to really step up in the days and years to come. I'm counting on you. You're ready. I've made sure of that. You'll be fine as long as you remember me. Thus was born a sacrament, a ritual so important and so sublime that it has been called an outward sign of an inward grace and a visible sign of God's invisible reality. We have the profound privilege of marking this sacrament's birth here tonight. It's as though Jesus is saying to you and I, you'll have to really step up in the days and years to come. I'm counting on you. You're ready. I've made sure of that. You'll be fine as long as you remember me. Let's do exactly